Let's see.
I think we'll wait maybe two or three more minutes for a few more people to hop on, and then we'll get started.
Will you say something one more time?
Hello?
Okay, good. Yeah, I've got a slightly higher quality microphone here that works better for these kinds of things. So I just wanted to make sure, because before it wasn't working, but now it seems to be. So.
Cool.
Hello, Jackson.
How's it going?
Good.
Jackson, I'll make you a co-host as well, so you can help out with the moderation.
Awesome. Sounds good.
I think we can get started, and then people can slowly trickle in as we talk. But hi everyone, I'm Emily. I'm the co-president of the Harvard Undergraduate Clean Energy Group, along with Robert Powell. And we're really excited to have you all join us today for our second speaker webinar for the month of April. So I see some familiar names here who joined us, of people who joined us for our last speaker webinar with Professor Dan Schrag. And today we have Professor George Baker, who is visiting professor at the Harvard University, the Center for the Environment. So I'll let Professor Baker, do more of the introductions and tell you a bit more about himself as well before he launches into talking about the integration of renewables on the grid. And in terms of how this will run, it'll be 30 to 40 minutes of presentation by Professor Baker, and then the remaining 20 or so minutes will be question and answer. So anyone can ask a question, and you can either do that by raising your hand. There's a button at the bottom for that, or you can just type your question directly into the chat, and then Professor Baker can take it directly. So yeah, we can get started.
Right. I will appreciate it if, in particular, I guess Emily or Jackson, but anyone for that matter, interrupts me if there's a hand up or if there's a chat message. I will try and pay attention to all three of those channels at the same time along with my talk. But if I fail to do that, please don't hesitate to interrupt.
Okay, sounds good.
And also, just as a matter of process, I'm also very happy for people to interrupt in the middle, ask questions. If we end up having the comments during the, I have about 30 to 40 minutes of stuff to say, but if we end up having the comments during the presentation itself, that's just fine with me. So.
Okay, awesome.
Let's see. I think I better share my screen, huh? All right. Can everybody see that screen? Good. Okay. Okay, I'm now trying to get all of you up. Looks like most people have turned off their cameras, which is just as well. I apologize in advance. I'm actually in a fairly remote place in the middle of a wild storm. So hopefully my internet will hold up, but the wind is blowing about 40 or 50 miles an hour out there. So we're gonna hope for the best on this. So I'm going to talk a tiny bit about my background and how I got here, because it's not quite standard. I taught economics at Harvard Business School for about 20 years. I'm an organizational economist. I studied compensation incentive systems in organizations. And about 10 years ago now, a little bit more than that, I got involved with a renewable energy project on an island in Maine called Vinyl Haven. and ended up as the pro bono developer of a 4.5 megawatt wind farm on that island. It's owned by the local electric co-op. It's the largest community-owned renewables project east of the Mississippi River. At least it was a few years ago. I haven't checked recently. And after that was up and commissioning and running, this mathematician from MIT came to me and said that she had a technology for how to help balance renewables on the electric grid. And I got interested in it, and I ended up quitting my job at Harvard and going and with her starting a company called VCharge that built Transactive energy management systems. Did that for about 7 years. We sold the company. I ended up moving to England actually for 3 years to try and build the company over there, and ended up selling the company about 2.5 years ago to a British energy supplier. I came back to Boston, and I'm now doing mostly consulting, but ever since I actually never left Harvard, because after I gave up my tenured appointment, I got an appointment at HUCE. And as some of you know, I have continued to teach a junior tutorial on renewable energy as part of ESPP. So thus I'm a visiting professor, although I'm not really visiting from anywhere, but that's the title that I have. And as I say, teach a course in the spring and have for the last few years. Actually, I was on a hiatus when I lived in England, but have been teaching it for a few years now. So I have been interested in the problem of how we integrate renewables on the electric grid, and in particular, the role of the load side of the grid in solving that problem. And I intended to spend a bunch of this time talking about the load side of the grid and transactive energy management. And then I realized as I was sort of preparing my talk over the last few days that just getting people to understand the current electric grid and the role of renewables in that is a 30 to 40 minute talk to start with. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the grid. Hopefully this will be new and interesting to many of you. It certainly has been new and interesting to me as I've learned it over the last several years. And if everybody really wants to hear more about transactive energy management, because we'll only probably have a little time for that at the end, I'm happy to come back and talk about it some more. So I want to talk about electrifying the energy system. So most of you have probably seen this graphic. Comes out of Livermore Labs, and it shows all kinds of interesting things. You can spend 45 minutes just staring at this picture and continue to learn interesting things every 5 minutes. But one of the interesting things is that in terms of end use, electricity is only 20% of the energy use of the US economy. So this raises the question, what if we were to try and electrify the entire US energy system? What would that mean for, at a systems level, for what it is that we're trying to do? So let's just take a look at that for a second. Okay? So here's a kind of picture of the electric grid in one stylized form. US grid capacity is about 1 terawatt, although you got to be super careful about this, because in fact, the total amount of generation in the United States is about 1 terawatt. But if you were to run the following thought exercise, take every single meter on every single electrical device, house, whatever, in the country, aggregate them all up, and look at what that looks like over the course of a year, that number would never exceed about 650 to 700 gigawatts. So how come we have 1 terawatt of generation? We do not need that 50% overcapacity. And the answer, of course, is that all of the places don't peak at the same time. We're in 4 different time zones. When it's peak in New York, it's not yet peak in California. And by the time it's peak in California, it's no longer peak in New York. And very importantly, we can't move the power back and forth. Notice if we could move the power back and forth, these non-coincident peaks wouldn't matter, but we can't. And I'll talk a whole lot more about that over the course of the next few minutes. So we're going to talk about the peak of the grid as if it's something like 1 terawatt, or maybe something more like maybe something like 700 gigawatts. But really, you got to be really careful about this, because the notion of a grid is not a good description of what is happening in the United States and North America. Okay, but we're gonna ignore that for just a minute and just ask the question: what if we tried to electrify the entire U.S. energy system? Okay, so current electricity use on that 1 terawatt or 700 gigawatt grid is about 360 gigawatt hours per hour. That is the average load on the electric grid, okay, or 360 gigawatts. Okay, just I know these units are confusing, but a gigawatt hours per hour is the same as gigawatts, okay? So it's about a third of the capacity of the grid. And you might say, why do we have such a big grid if the average load is only 360 gigawatts? And of course, the answer is because it's not constant. It's very far from constant. In fact, it's super peaky. And so the peak is more than twice the average is what it comes down to, okay? So, but that's the starting point. Now we're going to ask what would happen if we took all of those things that currently use natural gas and fuel oil. We're not talking about diesel and petrol right now. We're talking about natural gas and try to electrify them. Well, that's another 560 gigawatt hours per hour. So you can see that already is way more than we can do on the electric grid. There's just that trying to move that much energy over the existing US electric grid is not possible given what we have right now. And we haven't even done the cars yet. And once we try and do the cars and trucks, we're so far out of the money. It's just, it's just, so the biggest problem that we're going to have if we want to move to a renewables, low carbon energy system is to fix the grid. And there's lots of different ways to think about fixing the grid, but the grid is the bottleneck if we want to move towards a low carbon, high renewables grid. Now, the careful readers among you will realize that this isn't quite right, because about half, all of the residential and most of the commercial oil and gas load is actually space heating. And we could actually do that with heat pumps. And heat pumps are about 3 to 4 times as efficient, meaning the amount of energy that they use to provide a given amount of heat. So we need to make a correction in this one because these things are just burning the stuff, and we actually could use electricity, which is more efficient, and we could get more heat out. So this one's going to change. And of course, electric motors are about 4 times as efficient as internal combustion engines. So this shouldn't be 900 gigawatt hours per hour. It should be more like 200 and something gigawatt hours per hour. But even if you do that correction, we still are never going to make it on the existing grid. Okay? So that is an important thing to recognize if we want to move towards electrifying the energy system. By the way, the situation in Great Britain is about the same, except it's a factor of 10, roughly a factor of 10 smaller. But it's about the same it's the same kind of situation that you see in any large industrialized economy. This is what things look like. Okay, so let's actually look at the grid for a second. What the grid in North America actually looks like and what its capabilities are. And the first thing to realize is that there actually are 3 grids in America. There is the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and yes, Texas. Texas is a grid of its own. It is essentially not connected to the other 2 grids. These things are connected via DC interties, which have very low capacity. So the way to think about this, what an interconnection means is that they all share the same AC power. They all have exactly the same system frequency within each interconnect, but they have different system frequencies, completely different. They are out of phase with each other across those DC interties. Okay? But the first thing to realize is we simply can't move wind power from the wind belt to California. We just can't do it. We do not have anything like the capacity for doing that. And if you look in more detail at what the transmission system in the US looks like, if you thought the grid was an interstate highway system, that is just not at all what it is. It's a series of quite small little wires doing very specific things. So let me just show you a few of the interesting things on this picture. Okay, so the only really high power lines here are these high voltage DC lines. So let's just look at those. Okay, so here's the first one. This one runs from the Columbia River Valley to Southern California. It was built in the 1970s to take the surplus power from the Bonneville Power Project and bring it down to power-hungry Southern California. It carries electricity almost always in this direction, and it doesn't have any stops in between. It is designed to move power from a point generation source to a large load area. Okay, that's what it is. It's not designed to be moving power around during times of differential load. Okay, this one is interesting. So this nexus right here is Las Vegas plus the Hoover Dam. So a bunch of these power lines are designed to move electricity into Vegas. As you know, Vegas is a gigantic power hog, but a bunch of these lines are actually moving Hoover Dam power into Southern California. Okay? But what the heck is this high voltage DC line running from Utah? Well, if you go look at the map of power plants in the United States, see that big ugly gray area thing right there? That's a massive several gigawatt coal-fired power plant. And that line moves power from that power plant to Vegas. No power flows in that direction on that line. Utah has more generation than it needs. Okay, but they are moving power on once again a dedicated line from that giant coal-powered power plant complex up there down to Las Vegas. This is very similar. Once again, if we go look at the power plant map, we will see there are 3 big coal-fired plants there in North Dakota, and they are moving power to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and to Duluth, to the industrial load in Duluth. Okay? Once again, big transmission lines designed to carry electricity from point generation sources to load centers. And then finally, this is ours. This moves the power from Hydro-Quebec to us. It brings power from Quebec, from all of the massive amount of hydro they have down there, down to Boston. And it serves the power needs of New England. And I think a little bit of that power ends up getting to California, getting to New York. The only other high voltage lines here at all is this stuff. This is moving Tennessee Valley Authority power up to the big cities in the Midwest. And other than that, these are all pretty small lines. So once again, you can see that we do not have a power system that actually could move bulk power long distances. All right, so the result of that is pictures like this. Some of you will have seen these before. This is a picture of electricity prices in the Midwest. Okay? This was from just a few weeks ago in March. Sorry. And this is color coded for electricity prices. Blue cool numbers. Blue is 0 price. Purple is negative price. And the warm colors are high prices. So you can see up here in Minnesota, the price is running $96 a megawatt hour. That's 9.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a very high wholesale price. And the prices down here, only a few hundred miles away, are negative. You can be sure that if they could move the power from here to here, someone would be buying it. The only way those price differentials can be maintained is if there's no transmission. This happens all the time. Okay? This is a big wind farm in eastern Iowa. It's got negative prices all the way around it, even though the prices are literally 100 miles away. Those are prices in the 7, 8, 9 cents a kilowatt hour, but they're negative here. By the way, negative price, that means you pay when you generate electricity. You get paid when you consume electricity. I know it seems bizarre, but it happens all the time. And these pictures are the best evidence that there is that the electric grid cannot move bulk power from point A to point B, right? Because if it could, this could never happen, because you could never sustain a negative price here and a high positive price there. This is not restricted to the Midwest. Oh, sorry, before we get there, a little bit about moving energy with wires. Okay. So this is the largest electric transmission line in the world. It's a 12 gigawatt DC, high voltage DC line in China. It can move about 40 MBTUs per hour. Right? That's the amount of energy that can be moved over that transmission line. This is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline when it was full. It's currently only running at about half capacity, but when it was full, it could carry about 450 MBTUs per hour. About 10 times what can be carried on the largest electric transmission line in the world. This is 70 coal trains a day moving out of Wyoming, which is about the average number of coal trains per day that move out of Wyoming. It moves 1.1 million MBTUs per hour every day of the year. Okay? So when it comes to moving energy, wires don't have very much capacity relative to pipelines and certainly relative to unit coal trains. By the way, this is that 360 gigawatts of average load on the US grid. We move as much power with coal trains out of Wyoming as we move on the US electric grid on average. Okay? So once again, just demonstration that the grid is not a bulk power moving system. Okay? Now, so how is it that you can keep that thing working? How do we balance this grid? And the answer is So this is called, this is George's handy dandy guide to grid balancing in 3 easy steps. Okay, so here's the first step. Generation must equal load at all times and on all time scales. Every second, every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year over a 5-year period. It doesn't come from nowhere, and we don't have anywhere to put it if we don't consume it. So generation has to equal load. That's first step. Second, consumers, residential, commercial, industrial, pay no attention to when they turn things on. That is only a slight overstatement. A few large industrial customers like aluminum smelters may pay attention to the price of electricity, but almost no one else does. Okay? So from the standpoint of grid control, load is uncontrollable. And what that means is that managing the grid means adjusting generation to meet fluctuating load. And that is the control problem that gets solved in the control rooms of virtually every electric grid in the world. It's not easy, especially given the enormous time and space specificity of both electric generation and electric load. Okay, so how is it possible that they do this? And there is a one-word answer to that question. It's called storage. And most of that storage is in the form of natural gas tanks, oil tanks, and gigantic piles of coal stacked up outside power plants. Right? And if you didn't have that storage, a little bit this is a pumped hydro facility. This is the largest pumped hydro facility in Europe. It's called the Norweg in Western Wales. Spectacular. If you ever have a chance to go there, it's really amazing. So the point is that we do have storage on the grid. It's just not electric storage. It's storage of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have 2 very wonderful things about them from the standpoint of running running an energy economy. One is it's got very high energy density, so you can put a small amount of it in the tank of your car and drive 450 miles. But the second wonderful thing about fossil fuels from this standpoint is that it is stable at the Earth's temperature and atmospheric pressure, so that you can just put it in a pile or put it in a can and it will sit there until you want to use it. And those 2 things together make it possible for us to deliver energy whenever anybody flips a switch. I like to say that, every living thing on Earth, animals, plants, bacteria, algae, have learned to survive on intermittent energy input, except one, and that's us. Right? We don't live on intermittent energy input. We live on absolutely guaranteed energy input. Whenever we push the button, whenever we turn the key, we have energy and we can go where we want to. And it is because we can store it in fossil fuels. That is the simple answer to that. There's lots of other engineering issues, but that is the simple answer to that problem. So now let's look. So that would sound like storage is the solution. Let's store electricity instead of storing gas. But here's the problem. Okay, so this is a simple storage technology. It's called a 5-gallon gasoline can. It holds, that 5-gallon gasoline can holds about 175 kilowatt hours of energy, and it costs about 12 bucks. Okay, so that's 7 cents a kilowatt hour is what it costs to store gasoline. To the right is the cheapest battery I could find on the internet. It is a Legend Premium from Pep Boys. It stores about 0.96 kilowatt hours. It actually has 80 amp hours of storage at 12 volts, so that's 960 watt hours. It costs 90 bucks. Actually, it costs $89.99 at Pep Boys. That's $94 a kilowatt hour. That's over 1,000 times more expensive. Now, once again, we want to be a little bit careful because this thing actually isn't electricity and isn't as valuable electricity. This thing actually stores electricity. This guy only stores gasoline. If we want to turn that into electricity, we're going to have to do it in a power plant that's only about 25% efficient. So let's quadruple the cost of storage for gasoline to make it an apples to apples comparison. And the battery is still 340 times as expensive as the gas can. And oh, by the way, if you buy this as a 5,000 gallon can instead of a 5-gallon can, it only costs about $1 a watt. Sorry, it only costs about, this, as you can see, this is about $3 a kilowatt. The price drops a lot as you start getting bigger and bigger storage vessels for fossil fuels. And by the way, coal doesn't even require a vessel. Coal you just leave in a pile on the ground. Okay, so we are a very long way. We are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude away from having electrical storage that is as cost effective as fossil fuel storage. And by the way, also, this battery won't cycle more than a few hundred times before it's dead. So it's actually not going to do a very good job for the job that we need it for. If you want to go with lithium ion, that's $300 a kilowatt hour, not $90 a kilowatt hour. So it's battery storage. It's the holy grail. It's the long-term solution, but we're very, very far from it. So we have to figure out a way to, if we want to move towards an electrified energy system, we got to do it a little bit sooner than we can probably do it with batteries. Okay, notwithstanding what Elon Musk says, yes, batteries are getting cheaper. They are getting cheaper. Their price is coming down. They've got a very, very long ways to go before they're going to solve this problem. Okay, so what about a high renewables grid? So renewables historically have been expensive, intermittent, and distributed. Okay, really and truly, they are no longer expensive. Renewables have gotten pretty cheap, but they're still intermittent and they're still distributed. Okay, the current grid can't move the power around, and there's no cheap stars to solve the intermittence problem. So what are we going to do? Okay, so I want to show you one other thing, one other consequence of this, which is I think incredibly important for us to think about in terms of opportunities and how to manage this. So we ran a little exercise. It's actually based on an exercise that some of you may have done. It's put together by Dan Schrag for his course. Lauren Kuntz, who some of you may remember, one of his graduate students, and he put together this exercise. And the idea was to choose the amount of wind, solar, and battery to keep a house in Boston, to keep the Boston load profile fully supplied over the course of the year. And they got realistic models of wind and realistic models of solar, and then you had to mix and match between the size of a solar panel, the size of a wind turbine, and the size of a battery, to deal with the daily intermittence and the weekly intermittence timescales. The challenge, of course, is what happens when it's cloudy and not windy for 3 days. That turns out to be the problem that you need to solve. And I did a little bit of work on this and added the reasonable costs for wind, solar, and battery. And it turns out that the optimal mix per household is about 7 kilowatts of solar and 8 kilowatts of wind and about 20 kilowatt hours of storage. Okay, so that's what it is. But here's the remarkable thing. After you've done this and you've put together this little model that answers the question, what is the least cost way of solving the renewables intermittence problem, over 50% of the generated power is thrown away. Why in the world is this the case? And the answer is because storage is so expensive that it's worth building, just to give a simple example, enough solar that at 8 o'clock in the morning, we can power the house so that we don't have to have stored all of that power overnight. Because building a big enough battery to store all that power overnight is not cost effective. So just build a whole bunch more solar, but then in the middle of the day, we've got way more than we know what to do. And so we end up throwing away a whole lot of solar in the middle of the day and a whole lot of wind on windy days because we want to be able to power the grid when it's not fully windy. Okay, so this is called curtailment, and curtailment is a feature of all models of low carbon electric grids. And it happens for exactly this reason. Storage is too expensive, and so we overbuild the renewables and end up curtailing them off. And this is not just a theoretical problem. So let me show you. This is data from last November on the Irish electric grid. The blue line is the aggregate load, total system load in Ireland on that week in November of 2019. And green is wind generation in Ireland. Ireland is the grid with the highest renewables penetration in the world. But let me be a little bit clear on this. Germany claims fairly regularly that it was 100% renewable yesterday. Okay, and what that means is that if you add up all the renewable generation in Germany during a 24-hour period, it was equal to all of the load in Germany over that same 24-hour period. But just ask the Czechs, the French, the Italians, the Swiss, or the Spaniards whether Germany was 100% renewable. And the answer is not even close. Because during the middle of the day, they're exporting huge amounts of power to those countries, and those guys are all turning off their fossil-fired power plants fossil fuel fired power plants in order to accept this. And then all during the night, they're importing electricity like crazy from those places because they don't have any solar. Okay? And so when Ireland says they're 80% renewable, Ireland has 2 little extension cords to Great Britain. And other than that, they are completely on their own in terms of powering their electric grid. Okay, so I just want to show you something. It's just kind of interesting to see how this works. So you can see wind is not particularly helpful when it comes to powering the grid. You know, here we go, and we're going along, and there's no wind. And there's the morning peak, and you know, the wind decides to come on right in the middle of the day just when we don't need it. And then just when we need it even more, it's kind of, you know, ho-humming along. And then it's reasonably helpful here, but then here it's a disaster, because notice this is like there's no wind blowing right through the middle of the day. So it's essentially uncorrelated with electric load, except for these funny 3 places. What the heck is this? Does anybody know what that is? That's the Irish electric grid turning off the wind. Those are 3 periods of curtailment because they can't let this go above that. In fact, they won't let wind be more than 80% of total load because they're so afraid of the intermittence that and the instability that comes when you try and put too much what's called non-synchronous generation on the grid. Okay, so this is actual. Last year, Ireland curtailed off about 7% of their total wind generation because they didn't have enough load. Right? It always happens in the middle of the night, of course. You know, this is the trough, but this is actual manual curtailment. The grid operator sends out a signal to the wind farms and says, you got to shut down. And they all shut down proportionally. Okay, so notice what this means about a high renewables intensity grid. This means that on a regular basis, electricity is going to be free. Right? They're throwing it away here. If you could put something out there and say, hey, I'll take it, they'd give it to you for almost nothing. Okay? This is actually happening. This is the price of electricity during the month of February this past year in New England. This is right here. You will notice that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times during the month, the price of electricity went negative in New England. And if you look at what time it happens, you get a hint as to what's causing it. So this is at 1 o'clock in the morning. This is at noon and midnight. Okay, so all of these middle of the night ones is almost surely the wind blowing when there's no load. Okay, and all of a sudden we've got, you know, we've got more power coming in than we can deal with, and prices go negative. But these ones in the middle of the day, that's solar, right? Those are sunny days when rooftop solar is driving, rooftop and commercial solar are driving the amount of apparent load and generation up. Okay, and if this happens 7 times in New England, right? Imagine what it's doing in places where there's a lot of wind and a lot more renewables. This happens regularly in California as well. Right? And we all should be thinking about things that we could do with cheap intermittent energy. Just think about it, because it's coming our way. There's going to be a lot of cheap intermittent energy in our futures. Right? This is an entrepreneurial opportunity. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Haven't come up with any good one yet, but you guys are all going to be, in the aggregate, you guys are definitely cleverer than me. So I think this is really something to be thinking about. Right? What could you do with cheap intermittent energy? One of the things, by the way, that we're going to need to do, I'll tell you one story, and then I'm going to decide to be close to the end. The Prime Minister of Aruba asked a bunch of Harvard faculty to come and talk to them about how to turn the Aruban economy more green. And Aruba has 3 big loads. They have air conditioning for the resorts. They have imported energy to drive around a bunch of gasoline-powered cars, which you can see is just nuts. And they desalinate every single drop of water that they drink. There's no fresh water on the island, and they don't allow people to collect rainwater because they're afraid of tropical diseases. So I went out there. I had this brilliant idea, which is desalination is a perfect companion load to renewables, right? Because electricity is expensive to store. Water is cheap to store, Make water when the sun is shining, make water when the wind is blowing, build a few more tanks, and eliminate that load from your that desalination load from your fossil fuel plant, right? And just power all of that stuff with renewables. And they said, oh, no, we can't do that. We've just built this very, very expensive, highly efficient reverse osmosis water plant, and it's only cost effective if we run it 24/7. They have just eliminated they made the wrong technology choice, right? They didn't recognize this intermittent cheap power. Their power is incredibly expensive. They burn oil in a power plant. So their regular guaranteed 24/7 power costs about 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour, right? But their renewables would be incredibly cheap some of the time, right? But they made the wrong choice of technology. So we need to think about cheap technologies, which are okay if we only run them 30% of the time, that use really cheap energy. Anyway, that's my task to you. Okay, quickly, let me just say a bit about engineering of electricity, but very quickly. So electricity on fossil plants is generated by big spinning wheels that turn magnets through coils. These machines have a large amount of inertia and they can't change very fast. Okay, so this is where the renewables integration problem comes from. Existing load is uncontrollable and changes slowly. So this is a picture of the ISO New England load last October, one day. The largest 5-minute ramp in load in New England was about 2.5%, and the smallest 5-minute ramp was about -2.5%. Okay, so just load in the aggregate does not move fast. This is the law of large numbers combined with a lot of diversity. Okay? Once you add renewables, though, which are also uncontrollable, renewables change fast. Wind farms routinely ramp up 30% of their max over 10 minutes and ramp down by 60% of their max in 10 minutes. Solar is even worse. Solar can lose 50% of its output in a few seconds when a cloud goes in front of the sun. So you can see that the grid is designed for slow-moving generators to follow slow-moving load. And if we start throwing a whole lot of these renewables that can bounce around like this, we're going to trip out the grid. And this is what made Aruba nervous. This is what is making Ireland nervous. This is the challenge. This is true at a number of different timescales, but this is the challenge that grid operators around the world who are facing high renewables penetration are trying to deal with. As I say, the variability is at multiple timescales. There is frequency regulation, second to second. There's minute to minute. There's hourly. There's daily, and there's seasonal variability. All of which have to get dealt with somehow. So let me close by talking about using what we call transactive energy management, or the load side of the grid. The question is, can we turn load from the problem to be solved into part of the solution? And when I said load is uncontrollable, that's because it's uninstrumented and it's dumb. But if we made it instrumented and smart, then we could start using it. So the two sort of most obvious examples for this are hot water heaters and electric cars. The thing about both of them is they don't need the power. They have embedded storage. When you take a shower, we can have heated your water anytime, hours before you take your shower, and you'll have it there. Similarly, you get your car home at 5 o'clock at night, it doesn't need to charge as soon as you get home, right? It just needs to be charged by the time you want to go to work in the morning, okay? And so any device with embedded storage is a great candidate for putting on controls and allowing that load to respond to the needs of the grid. I'll just tell you a story about hot water heaters in the United States. Okay, so remember, the US grid average load is about 360 gigawatts. Peak load is about 700 gigawatts. There are 200 gigawatts of hot water heaters on the grid. If all of them came on at the same time, it would blow up the grid. Fortunately, they don't, right? They, in fact, the way hot water heaters work, as some of you will know, is that they monitor the temperature of the water in the tank, and anytime that temperature falls below a trigger, this great big element comes on and heats the water right back up again. On average, hot water heaters are on 1/8 of the time, about 3 hours a day, including, by the way, during the hottest summer afternoon of the year. About 1/8 of the hot water heaters are on at any moment in time. That means that we've got, what is that? 30 gigawatts or something of power doing something completely pointless, heating up water for people who don't need it when power is incredibly scarce. We could be, if we put instruments on those things and made them smart, we could have them charge during peak times when there's plenty of spare renewables, all of that kind of thing. Same thing with your EV, okay? Less obvious choices are space heating, electric space heating with heat pumps, clothes dryers and dishwashers, about 150 gigawatts of clothes dryers and dishwashers. We should just have a tariff that says, you only will turn on your dishwasher. You're going to let me turn on your dishwasher and your clothes dryer overnight. Okay? By the way, if you want to run it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you can. You got to push a button. I'm going to charge you $2.50 to run your dishwasher, and you'll have complete control of it if you want it. But most of the time, you're going to be perfectly fine to say, okay, George, as my aggregator, turn on my dishwasher tonight whenever you want to. Right? That would take an enormous amount of load and turn it into something that could be used to solve this problem instead of something that causes this problem. Okay? Air conditioning is a huge electric load, as you know. It's a problematic load, mostly because it comes on exactly at the time of the peak. It causes the peak. So what can we do about air conditioning load? The answer to that actually is thermal storage. A bunch of casinos in Las Vegas have started making ice during peak solar hours between 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then using that ice to keep the casinos cool during the peak air conditioning hours between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 9 o'clock in the night. Right? It's cheap, it's easy, and it shifts that load right from a time when the sun is going down and we don't have any solar anymore, right back into the period in the middle of the day when there's lots of excess solar and electricity is real cheap. In the Southwest now, electricity is real cheap in the middle of the day. Okay, so let me stop there. There's obviously lots more to say about all these things, but I want to have time for people to ask questions. I haven't quite given you the 20 minutes that I promised you. So let me turn it over to you guys. If there aren't questions, I can talk about some other things. So help me look for hands though. Oh, okay. Annalisa.
Hi, thank you so much. That was such an interesting talk. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the plans in China to build a high voltage, like AC/DC super grid, if you know about that.
I do know about that. Did you see the presentation last year from that guy from China who came to talk about that thing? He gave a talk over here. Did you see that? Yeah. So I'll tell you what I think. I haven't studied it hard. I spent some time looking at it after that talk and see. So here's what I see as a big problem with that, which is that if you do, it's going to be super expensive. Okay, those lines are going to be incredibly expensive. But if you do a quick calculation, Annalisa, about how much energy is actually going to flow over them, they will solve some big problems, but they're not going to carry much energy, even if they're super high capacity, just because there's only going to be a few times a day that they're even probably going to be energized. So I think they haven't really thought through the kind of cost benefit on that. I believe there are going to be cheaper alternatives to the problem of excess supply in China and excess demand in Europe than building a network of these, what looks like an international superhighway system for power, right? So as I say, I'm pretty skeptical about the economics of it. Now that doesn't necessarily stop the Chinese from doing things. They will go ahead and implement good ideas even if they don't appear to be cost effective. So I'm skeptical that it will ever actually come to pass. We were going to build an energy superhighway in this country too. That was part of the Obama administration's plan when they first came in, and one of the things they wanted to do with the stimulus money. It's really hard. The economics are very, very challenging, not to mention the fact that no one likes power lines. So you have huge NIMBY problems, and building transmission lines in the United States right now has become very difficult over any kind of long distance. So I'm skeptical of it, but I think it's interesting and worth looking at more carefully. Shelley.
Thank you. I don't know much about the China topic, so apologies if this is a similar question. But my general question was, like, you pointed out that it's really difficult to move power right now. Is the thing that's stopping America from creating a massive grid that could transport power where we need it science, or is it economics and politics?
Economics and politics. Sorry, let me think. Transmission lines are expensive, but not all that expensive. Okay, the physical lines themselves. Right-of-way acquisition and permitting is very difficult in this country. Basically everywhere except Texas. Texas, they just say, you want a line there? We'll build a line there. But in most places, you run into much more opposition. You run into opposition in Texas too, but the state Environmental Protection Agency doesn't care. So it's, then you can ask the question, well, why don't we come up with better transmission technology? Superconductors buried in the ground, stuff like that. You can't put really high voltage lines anywhere but strung on wires in the sky, because they get too hot if you try to put them in bunkers underground, and it also becomes very expensive. But if you had superconducting wires, you might be able to do something like that. So there are potential technology solutions that could change the fundamental economics, but right now it's mostly economics and, depending on what you call NIMBY, and politics. Right? It's hard to convince people to allow you to run power lines through their backyard. Sorry, NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. So it's a common problem in energy systems in this country in particular. Other countries too, increasingly. England has a problem with it. Don, you're unmuted, but I don't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I had two different audio setups here.
Yeah, I see two different versions of you on the screen too. Okay, yep. Except we're not seeing any version of you at all. Yep.
In your study of incentives, have you seen any clever ways of incenting building owners or landlords to make energy efficiency investments, even though their tenants are paying the bill?
This is a great question. This is one of the big problems with a lot of this energy stuff, especially exactly at the level of, you say, of landlords and tenants. There are a whole cluster of incentive problems around this issue, Don. So the first and most obvious one is the tenant pays the heating bill, but the landlord owns the capital equipment to make it more, if you make the thing more efficient. In theory, tenants should be happy to pay higher rent for apartments that use less energy. But unfortunately, humans aren't necessarily very good at doing that calculation. They look at the rent and they don't look at the electric bill at the same time. By the way, exactly the same problem happens in owner-occupied units when homeowners make energy efficiency improvements and spend a lot of money on it. In theory, they should be able to sell their house for more, because the next owner will say, oh, wow, that's really a nice low heating bill. I will be willing to pay more for that house. Again, humans don't seem to make those kind of calculations very well. Now, the miracle of the market economy has resulted in something called ESCOs, energy supply companies, who come in and say, here, and this works better for commercial industrial customers than it does for residential customers, but they make the following deal. They say to a company, here's your old energy bill, here's your cost per kilowatt hour of heat, or cost per therm of gas or whatever. We're going to come in, we're going to upgrade your building, you're going to pay 10% less for your energy for the next 10 years, you're going to pay it to us, and we're going to pay your energy bill. And they drive down energy use by 25% through their investments, and they make the difference. Okay, so you notice that the ESCO is now the one both making the investment and saving the money, and all the business says is, hey, my energy bill just went down by 10%. Okay, so there are kind of workarounds that get at this incentive problem that you raise. This is, by the way, also a problem. There's a program called, oh gosh, I can't remember what it's called. I was just looking at it the other day. If you make an energy improving investment in your house, the next owner, you get a kind of lien on your house that allows the next owner to take advantage of it. It's quite controversial. The banks don't like it, but so it's a great question. It's a great problem. I think there continues to be room for innovative thinking about incentives and organizational form to try and solve the problem. So, Michael.
Hey, thank you for the wonderful presentation. This was really informative. Somewhat related to that last question, could you discuss whether you think more types of load should be exposed to real-time pricing so as to actually provide that incentive for them to turn off? And how does that kind of sit next to the fact that essentially all of us have fully hedged the cost of our energy through our sort of retail supply contracts?
Great question. Okay. So, I don't think anybody, any residential consumer, really any commercial customer, wants to deal with fluctuating hourly prices of electricity. Right? I don't think that's a sensible way. Yeah, I'm an incentives guy. I don't want to look at the hourly price of electricity. I don't want to decide when I want to turn on my dryer. Right? However, there is a solution to this problem. Once again, there's an organizational solution to this problem, and it's called an aggregator or an aggregator energy supplier. So I did this. Okay, so I will describe to you exactly what I did in this little company that I told you about. There's a type of heater, not very many of them in the US, called an electric thermal storage heater. It's an electric heater that allows you to, it's basically it's a pile of bricks with electric heating elements in it, in an insulated box with a thermostatically controlled fan. You can put in energy whenever you want to, heat up those bricks. It will stay hot. When you want heat, you turn on the fan, you blow the heat off the bricks. Okay, so it's a way of storing energy in the form of heat. Okay, we went into a bunch of homeowners in Pennsylvania. We said, let us put controls on your heaters. We will be your energy supplier. We became an energy supplier in Pennsylvania. We were probably the smallest energy supplier in the state. We had about 300 customers. But we told our customers, we will sell you electricity for your electric heat at 25% below the current price. And then we would go in and we would charge those bricks when the wholesale price was low. Okay? We were paying the wholesale price. They were paying a fixed price, right? We passed on some of the savings to them and kept some of the savings for ourselves. So I think the key to getting price sensitivity into load flows through aggregators. People who will say to you, who will put a little control on your dishwasher and say, all you got to do is push this button and I guarantee you your dishes will be clean when you wake up in the morning. You let me decide when to turn it on. And by the way, you will pay less for that electricity than you would be paying if you had let me put this control on. And now we've gotten the incentives to, but the important point is the party that turns things on gets the benefit of the low prices. That now gets landed in the aggregator instead of the end use consumer, and that system can really work. So as I say, I think the answer to that problem is not trying to push hourly prices down onto the end user. There's this horribly depressing statistic that those of us who are in the energy business know. It's probably not true, but which is that the average American spends 6 minutes a year thinking about their electricity bill. The 30 seconds each month it takes them to write the check. You know, it's just not a front of mind kind of issue, right? But somebody who comes in and says, hey, look, for nothing, let me come in, put a few controls on your appliances. I'll reduce your electric bill by 25%. Many people will say yes to that. And there's easily 25% savings if you actually pay attention to when the electricity is free. I mean, we used to get paid for heating people's houses by buying electricity during times when prices were negative. And we would just track along the price, and whenever we saw a negative price, we would turn on everybody's heat. We get a check from the grid operator at the end of the month for heating people's houses. Didn't happen very often. It happened once in a while. So you know, there are real opportunities there through this kind of aggregation role, which exists a little bit now for commercial industrial, but not very much for residential. But it could. So I got time for one more question if anybody wants. Am I seeing everybody, by the way? I'm a little concerned. I think if anybody puts up their hand, they show up on my screen, right?
Yeah, I think we have an extra question in the chat about what was the name of your company again?
The name of the company is VCharge. They don't exist anymore. They were bought out by a British energy supplier. I think they have, last I heard, they still had kept the name VCharge for certain of their functionality. They've mostly gone into EV charging, selling EV charging stations. I don't know what happens when you look up VCharge anymore. But we were a Providence, Rhode Island-based company. We started in 2010, provided grid services to ISO New England, PJM, and then National Grid in the UK before we sold out to a British energy supplier. Yeah, Robert. Oh, and then you, Micah. Yep.
So I was just wondering, so you're talking about all these solutions where, right, an outside firm comes in, they install energy efficiency, more inefficient appliances, etc. And so they're saving both the consumer money and also they're making money. So why do you think those schemes, other than like people not worrying about their electricity bill very often, why do you think those schemes haven't taken off more in the United States or even more broadly?
Well, so I mean, I think as Don said, very few of us see the time varying price of electricity. I would like to buy a wholesale price power. I can't do it. There's no utility offers a tariff that offers you real-time prices, right? And that's because they think, I think correctly, that it's just too complicated and too messy, and et cetera. So the main reason that they haven't taken off without the presence of aggregators is that end users don't see those things. The other reason that it hasn't taken off in the U.S., to be perfectly honest, is that fracking has reduced the price of electricity by 50%, and the volatility of electricity prices threefold. It used to be that in the middle of the night, electricity was generated by great big coal and nuclear plants, and it was almost free. And during the day, these expensive natural gas peaking plants came on, and electricity went up 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 times what they were in the middle of the night. It's very typical to have 2-cent electricity overnight and 10-cent electricity at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, it's all natural gas all the time. The base load plants are natural gas. The peaking plants are natural gas. The peaking plants are a little bit less efficient than the base load plants. So now prices range from $2 to 2 cents to 6 cents. High prices are now 6 cents a kilowatt hour, right? And so anybody who's trying to play on this price volatility for the last 10 years, that's why we moved to England. That's why we moved the company to England. Fracking was killing the economic model that said buy energy when it's cheap, because the differential wasn't there anymore. Okay, so that's been a huge impediment to the development of this stuff in the U.S. It's not the same in Europe. They don't have fracking in Europe. They don't have cheap gas. They buy their gas from those nasty Russians, and it's expensive. So that's been the real reason I think that this hasn't taken off. This is the reason, as they say, our business did not succeed in the U.S., and it was largely because of that trend in the electricity markets more than anything else. So, sorry, Micah, did you have a physical hand up?
Yeah, sorry.
Not a little blue hand, but a real hand.
It was complicated.
Okay.
My question is going back to when you were talking about the massive wind farm in Iowa.
Yeah.
Why does it make sense for them to build such a massive plant if the transmission isn't there to carry that electricity outside anywhere, and it turns the prices to negative?
So that's a really good question. And the answer is, it doesn't happen too often. Right? So they're probably going to get curtailed off. I mean, so go on this website sometime. It's the Midwest Independent Systems Operator, and just watch this. And what you'll see is, usually it's all the same color, because usually there aren't any of these problems. And then when there are these problems, the splotches move around. They don't stay in one place for very long, right? And so it's just like, I mean, frankly, why do they build it here? Because that's where the wind is, right? And they take into account the fact that they're going to have some bad prices. And it's just kind of part of the calculation. It is having a major impact on wind development in Ireland right now, because they're getting curtailed off enough now that the developers are saying, we can't make this work anymore. You're going to take away 5%, 7% of our output right off the top. We can't make it pay. So it is a problem, to be sure. It's a problem. So here you go. Just right. Think about, we tried to set up the company V-Charge. We tried to be selling heating systems in the Midwest where we could buy energy when those prices went negative. So, you know, you had a bunch of electric heat around that wind farm. You could do really great. Anyway, okay, we are past time unless anybody has one last, Don has one last question, it looks like. Which Don are we talking to?
This is Don Forrence.
Yeah, no, I know. We have two of you on our screen. That's what I'm saying. Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah. Just a follow on to that last question is, do you think that curtailment and the duck curve and these issues will create a risk for those who are developing renewables, solar or wind, where maybe they just won't get a price sufficient to cover their costs and we'll start to see less development of renewables?
There's no doubt about it. It's already happening. I had a conversation with a solar developer in Maine just the other day and said, look, I'm looking into the future. And, you know, yeah, right now, your solar is worth, you know, 4 cents a kilowatt hour, but we don't have to look out very far to see that, you know, you're going to be generating power right into the belly of the duck, and it's going to become worth less and less and less. So there's no question that absent transactive energy management, this is going to hurt the economics of renewables. That's why we all need to be thinking about good uses for intermittent, cheap energy. Because if everybody starts turning on their dryers in the middle of the day, that will firm up the prices. And it will be better for everybody, right? I mean, it will, right? So really, 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 these low prices, these negative prices, these duck curves are a result of inflexibilities in the system. They're resulting from the fact that load is not responding to the grid. Load is not a transactive asset. But if we can start moving in that direction, it really does help the economics of renewables. It's going to have to happen, or yeah, it's going to start being a big problem. Every time the wind blows, the price of electricity is going to go negative. You know, we're just going to build wind farms anymore. So there's no question that that dynamic is a risk to the development of renewables and to you know, to a low carbon energy system. And we need something like, as I say, like transactive energy management to try and figure out how to solve that problem.
Great. So I think that wraps up our webinar.
Sorry, can I ask one quick question?
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
I was just wondering on this transmission constraints graph, like
Yeah.
the pluses are sites where power is being generated, and then
No, those are just price nodes. Okay, so those are price nodes. Those are specific price nodes. And in fact, this price node is not labeled, but I can tell you, I can't remember the name of it. If you go on the MISO plant and hover over that thing, it's going to say something WF, which means wind farm. Right?
Gotcha.
Right. So this is these are all load nodes, right? Illinois hub, that's a load node. These are all load nodes that are lit up here. But that is almost surely a wind farm generation node.
And then the stars and diamonds.
Yeah, let's see, what is that? I don't know what those stars are.
Gotcha.
Those look like, yeah, I don't know exactly what they are. Wait,
I'll look at the
it tells us down here. See, a plus is generation, a star is a hub. I can't see it, but yeah, go on the website and take a look at it. It's fun. It's really fun to look at it. It's at miso-energy.org.
Awesome.
If you just type MISO, you'll get something about soup. But if you do miso-energy.org, you'll get this, and just look for the real-time price contour map.
Awesome. Thank you.
It's a hoot.
Okay, great. So I
Thanks,
think
everybody.
yeah, thank you so much, Professor Baker, for joining us today. I have to admit, when I saw you send over the title, Transactive Energy Management, I was a bit worried I wouldn't understand anything, but I think it was very, accessible and, easy, very straightforward. And to everyone else, thank you for tuning in. We will most likely be having a webinar next week or the week after. So if you haven't signed up to our email newsletter yet, please make sure to do so at huseg.org. But yeah, other than that, hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. And we'll see you guys hopefully soon. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.